British flag was lowered for the final time, and a new green-white-green banner rose in its place. For millions, it was a moment of hope. For the man standing at the center of it all, it was a burden heavier than celebration. That man was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Balewa did not look like a revolutionary. He spoke softly. He dressed modestly. He believed deeply in dialogue, compromise, and institutions. Yet history would place him at the helm of Africa's most populous nation at its most fragile moment. Nigeria was not born united, it was assembled. Over 250 ethnic groups, deep religious divides, regions with competing interests, and a colonial structure that had never truly prepared the country to govern itself. Balewa knew one truth above all others. Nigeria would only survive if its institutions were stronger than its divisions. Among those institutions, none mattered more than the military. At independence, Nigeria's army was small, inexperienced, and still shaped by colonial command. To Balewa, this was dangerous. A weak military could invite chaos. A politicized military could destroy democracy itself. So his government made a calculated decision, one that would later haunt the nation. Young Nigerian men would be selected, sponsored, and trained in the finest military institutions abroad. They would learn discipline, loyalty, and command. They would return as professionals, soldiers loyal not to tribe or ambition, but to the Nigerian state. It was an investment in stability, or so it seemed. Across the country, talented cadets were identified, intelligent, driven, idealistic. Many had grown up witnessing colonial rule and dreamed of a stronger, fairer Nigeria. Among them was a young officer whose name would one day echo through Nigerian history, Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu. At this stage, Nzeogwu was not a rebel. He was not a coup plotter. He was not a killer. He was a disciplined soldier, known for his sharp mind, strict personal code, and intense belief in order and justice. Like others of his generation, he was selected for advanced training overseas, part of the very system designed under Balewa's leadership. The Nigerian state paid. The Nigerian state trusted. The Nigerian state hoped. For Balewa, this was governance by foresight. He believed that exposure to world-class military professionalism would produce officers who respected civilian authority and constitutional rule. But history is rarely so simple. What Balewa could not fully control was what these young men would learn beyond tactics and drills. They would absorb ideas. They would compare Nigeria's fragile democracy to older systems. They would question corruption, ethnic politics, and what they saw as the failure of civilian leadership. And in some minds, a dangerous thought would begin to form. If politicians destroy the nation, does the soldier have a duty to save it? That question would grow quietly, far from Lagos and Kaduna, inside lecture halls, parade grounds, and officers' messes abroad. Balewa never imagined that one of the men trained under his watch would one day be linked to the violent end of his own government and his own life. At this moment in history, there was only optimism, only planning, only faith in the future. The Prime Minister believed he was building guardians of democracy. He did not yet know he was also helping shape the men who would challenge it, and that is where this story truly begins. When young Nigerian officers arrived in Britain for advanced military training, they entered a world far removed from the heat and politics of home. At the center of that world stood the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, an institution built not just to train soldiers, but to shape rulers of force. This was where empires had trained their guardians. Here, cadets were taught that the army was more than a profession. It was a moral institution, a final safeguard when nations drifted toward disorder. Among the Nigerian officers training abroad, Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu stood out. He was intense, uncompromising, almost ascetic in his lifestyle. Nzeogwu admired discipline above comfort. He rejected excess. He despised corruption. While others relaxed, he studied. While others socialized, he trained. To many instructors, he represented the ideal modern officer, sharp, decisive, and fearless in command. But Sandhurst taught more than obedience. It taught judgment. Cadets studied military history, moments when armies intervened in failing states. They examined coups, revolutions, and wars where soldiers believed politicians had lost legitimacy. In classrooms and informal discussions, one theme surfaced repeatedly: A nation could collapse not because its army was weak, but because its leaders were. For Nigerian cadets, these lessons hit close to home. News from Nigeria followed them abroad. Reports of election violence, regional crises, political intimidation, corruption whispered about, then spoken openly. To men like Nzeogwu, these were not abstract headlines. They were warnings. He began to see Nigeria not as a young democracy finding its feet, but as a nation drifting dangerously off course. And in that belief, a transformation quietly began. The Nigerian government, under Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, had hoped foreign training would produce officers loyal to civilian rule. Instead, for some, it produced officers who believed civilian rule must earn loyalty. Nzeogwu absorbed British military professionalism, but filtered it through his own rigid moral lens. He did not admire luxury, he admired sacrifice. He did not respect power, he respected purpose. To him, corruption was not a political flaw, it was treason against the nation. And treason, in a soldier's mind, demanded correction. By the time Nzeogwu returned to Nigeria, he was no longer just an officer in uniform. He was an ideologue. Stationed in Kaduna, far from the political heart of Lagos, he trained troops relentlessly. He insisted on discipline. He rejected bribes. He spoke openly about the decay he saw in the political system. To some fellow officers, he was admirable. To others, unsettling. But few doubted one thing. Nzeogwu believed deeply that Nigeria was heading toward disaster, and that someone had to act. What he did not yet know was how to act. That answer would come not from a single event, but from accumulation. Each crisis adding weight, each failure sharpening resolve. The soldier trained by the state was now questioning the state itself. And once that line is crossed, history shows there is rarely a peaceful return. In the next chapter, Nigeria's political crisis deepens, and the idea of intervention moves from thought to plan. By 1964, Nigeria was no longer the hopeful nation celebrated at independence. It was restless, angry, fragmented. The political class had become trapped in bitter regional rivalry. Elections were increasingly disputed. Violence followed ballots. Trust in government eroded with every scandal whispered and every promise broken. The crisis in the western region was the breaking point. What began as political disagreement descended into chaos, arson, intimidation, street violence, and open lawlessness. Nigerians gave it a name, Operation Wedi. It was not just disorder, it was humiliation. Across the country, citizens watched as politicians appeared powerless, or worse, complicit. At the top of this fragile system stood Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Balewa was not a tyrant. He was cautious, constitutional, and deeply committed to civilian rule. But to many young officers, his restraint looked like weakness. In barracks and officers' messes, conversations changed. They no longer asked whether Nigeria was failing. They debated how long before it collapsed. Among those listening and speaking was Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu. Stationed in Kaduna, Nzeogwu was far from the political intrigues of Lagos, but not from their consequences. He read reports. He listened to the radio. He spoke with other officers who shared his frustration. To him, the problem was clear. The politicians had lost moral authority, and once legitimacy is lost, power becomes vulnerable. Slowly, quietly, the unthinkable began to feel necessary. The idea of a military intervention, once discussed only in theory, started to take shape as a real plan. Not a seizure of power for personal gain, but what Nzeogwu and his allies believed would be a corrective revolution. They told themselves they were not overthrowing democracy. They were saving Nigeria from itself. The group was small, highly disciplined, ideologically driven. Many were young officers who believed they had nothing to gain personally and everything to lose if the country continued on its path. Secrecy was absolute. There were no written plans, no broad consultations. Each participant knew only what he needed to know. Trust was based not on rank, but on belief. At the center of it all was Nzeogwu, charismatic, intense, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of action. Yet even within the group, there were uncertainties. Would the army support them? Would the people welcome them? Would Nigeria survive the shock? And looming over everything was the most dangerous question of all. What would happen to the nation's leaders? Balewa, the soft-spoken teacher turned prime minister, represented everything Nzeogwu believed had failed. Yet he was also a symbol of unity, legitimacy, and Nigeria's international respect. Removing such a figure was not just political, it was irreversible. As 1965 drew to a close, the country stood at a crossroads, but no referendum would decide its fate. The decision would be made in the dark, by men in uniform, with bullets, not ballots. And when the night of January 15th, 1966 arrived, Nigeria would wake up to a new and violent chapter, one written by soldiers trained to believe they were acting in the nation's best interest. In the next chapter, the coup unfolds, and history crosses a line from which it can never return. Just the sound of boots, engines, and whispered commands. Across key cities, Kaduna, Ibadan, Lagos, soldiers moved into position. This was not a mass uprising. It was a precision strike, led by a small group of young officers who believed history had chosen them. At the center of the operation stood Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu. In Kaduna, Nzeogwu acted decisively. Military installations were secured. Senior officers were arrested or killed. By morning, the Northern Military Command was effectively under his control. But in Lagos, the political heart of Nigeria, events took a darker, more chaotic turn. Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was taken into custody by soldiers during the confusion of the uprising. He was not executed on the spot. He was not tried. He was simply removed. For days, the nation waited. Radio silence fueled fear. Rumors spread wildly. Nigerians asked the same question in homes, markets, and barracks. Where is the Prime Minister? Then came the answer. Balewa's body was discovered on the outskirts of Lagos. He had been killed. The shock was immediate and permanent. Nigeria had crossed a line. To this day, historians debate the precise circumstances surrounding Balewa's death. What is clear is that it occurred in the aftermath of the coup led by officers associated with Nzeogwu. Even though the coup itself ultimately failed in Lagos and did not unfold exactly as planned nationwide. This distinction matters, but the symbolism matters more. The prime minister who believed in institutions, restraint, and dialogue was dead. And the men who had been trained, funded, and trusted by the Nigerian state had shattered the system they claimed to protect. When news spread, reactions were mixed. Some Nigerians felt relief, others felt terror, many felt confusion. The coup leaders had promised a moral revolution, but instead delivered bloodshed and uncertainty. Within days, the uprising collapsed. Senior officers who had not been part of the plot regained control. The army stepped in to restore order, not democracy. Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi emerged as the new head of government, marking Nigeria's first experience with military rule. As for Nzeogwu, he was arrested, not executed. The man who believed he was acting in Nigeria's best interest now faced the reality that revolutions do not belong to those who start them, but to those who survive them. The First Republic was over, civilian rule was gone, and the consequences would echo for decades. In the final chapter, we confront the legacy, the haunting irony of a state undone by its own guardians, and the lessons Nigeria still struggles to learn. History is rarely kind to idealists. In the aftermath of January 1966, Nigeria stood stunned, trying to understand how a nation built on hope had descended so quickly into violence. At the center of this tragedy were two men whose lives should never have collided the way they did. One was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, a schoolteacher turned statesman who believed deeply in gradual progress, dialogue, and constitutional order. He trusted institutions because he believed nations survive not through force, but through patience and compromise. The other was Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu, a soldier shaped by discipline, moral absolutism, and a belief that corruption was a disease that required surgery, not negotiation. Balewa invested in the military because he feared chaos. Nzeogwu rebelled because he believed chaos had already arrived. That is the central irony. The Nigerian state, under Balewa's leadership, sent young men abroad to become professionals, to protect democracy from instability. Yet the training, exposure, and confidence those officers gained also gave them the belief that they could judge democracy itself. When Nzeogwu acted, he did not see himself as a villain. In his own mind, he was a patriot correcting a failed experiment. But history does not measure intentions. It measures outcomes. The coup did not end corruption. It did not unify Nigeria. It did not usher in moral rebirth. Instead, it ended the First Republic, introduced military rule, and set Nigeria on a path where soldiers would dominate politics for decades. Balewa's death became more than a personal tragedy. It became a national wound. To this day, historians continue to debate responsibility, intent, and execution. But one truth remains unavoidable. Nigeria lost its civilian leadership to the gun, not the ballot. As for Nzeogwu, fate dealt him no victory. He did not rule Nigeria. He did not shape the new government. He became a prisoner of the very system he tried to overthrow, and later died during the Nigerian Civil War, long before the nation could fully judge his legacy. Both men paid the ultimate price, and Nigeria paid the longest price of all. Today, their story remains a warning, etched into the nation's history. A warning about what happens when institutions are weak, when corruption is ignored, when soldiers believe they must replace citizens, but also a warning about unintended consequences. Because sometimes the systems we build to protect ourselves become the instruments of our downfall. This is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of belief, fear, and fatal choices. And it asks a final question, one Nigeria still wrestles with: who truly guards the nation when the guardians themselves lose faith in it?